Good evening, everyone. Tonight, we're diving into something that has been whispered about in intelligence circles for months, but has now exploded into the open. This isn't just another scandal from Moscow. This is the kind of story that changes the course of history. This is about loyalty, betrayal, and the fracturing of one of the world's most feared military machines. Before we get into the details, if you find this analysis valuable, please hit that like button and subscribe. We're going to unpack this story layer by layer, and trust me, you won't want to miss what comes next. Let me start with what happened. Last Tuesday, a set of classified documents began circulating among Western intelligence agencies. These weren't just any documents. These were internal Kremlin communications, military strategy papers, and most damaging of all, private conversations between Putin's top generals. The content? Absolutely explosive. We're talking about senior military commanders questioning Putin's leadership, criticizing his war strategy in Ukraine, and most shocking of all, discussing contingency plans for a Russia without Putin at the helm. Think about that for a moment. These are men who built their careers on absolute loyalty to Putin, men who have stood beside him through decades of power consolidation. And now, they're planning for his exit. That's not just betrayal. That's a complete collapse of trust at the highest levels of Russian power. Here's what makes this so significant. In authoritarian regimes, the military isn't just a fighting force. It's the backbone of power. It's what keeps dictators in their palaces and dissenters in their graves. When that backbone starts to crack, everything becomes unstable. Putin has always presented himself as the strong leader, the one who brought order to Russia after the chaos of the 1,990 seconds. But strength in an authoritarian system is all about perception. The moment people start to see weakness, the moment the inner circle begins to fracture, that's when things can unravel very quickly. And that's exactly what we're witnessing now. This isn't just a leak. It's a signal that Putin's grip on power may not be as absolute as it once was. To understand why this betrayal is happening now, we need to go back to February 2022. That's when Putin launched his invasion of Ukraine, expecting a quick victory. He thought his military would roll into Kyiv within days, that the Ukrainian government would collapse, and that the West would do nothing but issue strongly worded statements. He was wrong on every count. Ukraine didn't collapse. They fought back with a ferocity that stunned the world. The West didn't just issue statements. They armed Ukraine, sanctioned Russia, and isolated Moscow on the global stage. And Putin's military? They revealed themselves to be far less formidable than anyone had imagined. We saw logistical failures, troops without food, tanks without fuel, soldiers with outdated equipment. We saw tactical blunders, with Russian forces getting bogged down in poorly planned offensives. And most telling of all, we saw massive casualties. Tens of thousands of Russian soldiers have died in this war, and for what? To capture a few devastated cities while losing territory elsewhere? Now put yourself in the shoes of a Russian general. You've spent your entire career in the military. You know strategy. You know tactics. You know what a well-run war looks like. And then your commander-in-chief, who has no military training, who makes decisions based on politics rather than military reality, orders you to execute a plan that you know is doomed to fail. What do? If you speak up, you risk being dismissed or worse. But if you stay silent, you watch your soldiers die in a war that can't be won. That's the impossible position these generals have found themselves in. For months, we've heard rumors of tension between Putin and his military leadership, reports of generals being fired or quietly reassigned, whispers of disagreements over strategy. But this leak? This is confirmation that the tension has reached a breaking point. History has a way of repeating itself, especially in authoritarian regimes. When things start to go wrong, dictators often turn on their own people. Stalin did it in the 1,930 seconds, purging his officer corps right before World War II, which left the Soviet military devastated. Saddam Hussein did it repeatedly, executing generals who dared to question him. Putin seems to be following the same playbook. Since the war began, we've seen a steady stream of Russian generals either dying under mysterious circumstances or being quietly removed from their positions. Some have been blamed for military failures. Others simply disappeared from public view. But here's the thing about purges. They don't create loyalty. They create fear. And fear, while it can control people in the short term, eventually breeds resentment. It breeds desperation. And ultimately, it breeds betrayal. Let's get into the specifics of what these leaked documents reveal. I want to be clear that while we can't verify every single detail, intelligence sources across multiple Western agencies have confirmed the authenticity of these communications. First, there are the strategy criticisms. In one leaked conversation, a senior general describes the Ukraine operation as fundamentally flawed from the beginning. He talks about how the intelligence assessments were wrong, how the military was given unrealistic objectives, and how political considerations overruled military advice at every turn. This general, whose name has been redacted for obvious security reasons, explicitly states that continuing the current strategy will lead to nothing but more Russian casualties without achieving any meaningful military objectives. That's not subtle criticism. That's a complete rejection of Putin's war plan. But here's where it gets really interesting. The leaks don't just show military criticism. They show active planning for a post-Putin Russia. In several documents, military leaders discuss what they call transition scenarios. They talk about the need to preserve military cohesion and state stability in the event of political change. They discuss potential leadership candidates and how to ensure a smooth transfer of power. Now, you might think this is just prudent planning. After all, Putin is in his 70s, and any responsible military should think about succession. But the context matters. This isn't abstract planning for some distant future. These conversations are happening now, in the middle of a war, at a time when Putin is supposed to be firmly in control. The very fact that these generals feel the need to plan for Putin's removal, and the fact that they're communicating about it with each other, tells us that they've lost faith in his leadership. They're not just waiting for him to die of natural causes. They're preparing for a change that they may themselves precipitate. The leaks also reveal something that Putin has tried desperately to hide from the Russian people: the true economic cost of this war. One document includes a frank assessment of Russia's economic situation. It acknowledges that sanctions have been far more effective than public statements suggest. It discusses the strain on military production, the difficulty in obtaining critical components for weapon systems, and the growing budget deficit caused by war expenditures. Most damning of all, it projects that if the war continues at its current intensity, Russia will face severe economic constraints within the next year. We're talking about potential shortages of basic goods, inflation spiraling out of control, and a military that may struggle to maintain its equipment and supply its troops. This is information that contradicts everything Putin has been telling his people. He's been saying the economy is strong, that Russia can sustain this war indefinitely, that sanctions are having minimal impact. But his own generals know the truth, and now, so does the rest of the world. If Russia's economy truly is on the brink of crisis, if ordinary Russians start to feel real economic pain, not just inconvenience, but actual hardship that creates the conditions for political instability. And the generals know this. They can read the same economic reports. They understand that an economic collapse could threaten not just Putin's rule, but the stability of the entire Russian state. Imagine being Vladimir Putin right now. You've built your entire power structure on loyalty and fear. You've surrounded yourself with people who owe their positions, their wealth, and in many cases their lives to you. And now you discover that even your most trusted military commanders are discussing your potential removal. The psychological impact of this betrayal cannot be overstated. Putin is a former KGB officer. He understands intelligence, counterintelligence, and the importance of operational security. The fact that such sensitive communications were leaked tells him one thing. He has a serious problem with loyalty at the highest levels of his government. This creates a vicious cycle. Putin's response will likely be increased paranoia, more purges, and tighter control. But those actions will only increase resentment among his remaining supporters. The more he cracks down, the more people will start looking for ways to protect themselves, which means more potential leakers and more potential betrayers. But the psychological impact extends far beyond Putin himself. Think about the Russian military as a whole. When soldiers see that even their generals don't believe in the war, when they learn that their leaders are planning for defeat rather than victory, what does that do to morale? We've already seen signs of morale problems in the Russian military. There have been reports of units refusing orders, of soldiers surrendering rather than fighting, of desertion rates climbing. This leak will only accelerate those trends. When you're asking young men to risk their lives in combat, they need to believe in the mission. They need to trust that their leaders have a plan, that their sacrifice means something. But how can they believe that when the leaked documents make it clear that even the generals think this war is a disaster? Let me be more specific about what low morale looks like in practical terms. It means soldiers who are more likely to surrender when surrounded rather than fight to the death. It means officers who are less willing to take risks or push their units hard. It means logistical personnel who are less diligent about maintaining equipment or ensuring supplies get to the front lines. All of these small individual decisions, driven by a lack of belief in the mission, add up to a military that performs far below its theoretical capability. And that gap between what Russia's military should be able to do on paper and what it actually accomplishes on the battlefield, that gap is widening, and these leaks will make it wider still. On the global stage, this leak fundamentally changes how other nations will view Russia. For years, Putin cultivated an image of Russia as a strong, unified power under firm leadership. That image is now shattered. Other authoritarian leaders who might have admired Putin's grip on power are now seeing the cracks. Democratic nations that feared Russian strength are realizing that Russia's military is far weaker than advertised, and its leadership is far more fragile. This matters because power in international relations isn't just about actual military capability. It's about perception. It's about whether other countries believe you'll follow through on your threats. And right now, the perception of Russian power is crumbling. For Ukraine, this leak represents a strategic opportunity. These leaks confirm what Ukrainian intelligence has probably known for some time, that Russia's military is plagued by internal dissension, that their logistics are strained, and that their leadership is fractured. This information allows Ukraine to plan their operations with greater confidence. When you know your enemy is divided, when you know their generals don't believe in the war they're fighting, you can exploit that. You can target their weak points, you can undermine their morale, and you can push for negotiations from a position of strength. For NATO and the Western Alliance, these leaks change the strategic calculus in several important ways. First, they reduce the perceived risk of Russian escalation. If Putin's own generals are questioning his judgment, they're less likely to follow orders for truly catastrophic actions like the use of nuclear weapons. Second, they strengthen the argument for continued support to Ukraine. The leaks show that Russia is not the invincible force that some feared. With continued Western support, Ukraine has a real chance not just to survive, but to win. Third, they raise questions about post-war planning. If there's a real possibility of regime change in Moscow, the West needs to think about what comes next. Who would take over? Would they be more or less dangerous than Putin? How can the international community shape the transition to ensure stability? So, what are the possible outcomes here? Let me lay out a few scenarios, understanding that reality is often more complex than any prediction. Scenario 1. Putin doubles down. He responds to this betrayal with a massive purge of military leadership, replacing the skeptics with loyalists. This might shore up his position in the short term, but it would likely make the military less effective and increase the chances of eventual collapse. Scenario 2. Putin seeks a face-saving exit from Ukraine. Recognizing that he can't win and fearing further erosion of his power base, he looks for a way to end the war while claiming some kind of victory. This might involve negotiations, possibly mediated by China or another power that has maintained relations with both sides. Scenario 3. A coup or succession crisis. If the generals decide Putin has become too much of a liability, they might move to replace him. This could happen through a formal process or through more direct action. The risk here is instability, possibly even civil conflict within Russia. Scenario 4. Putin hangs on but becomes increasingly isolated and ineffective. He remains in power formally but loses the ability to make meaningful decisions. Russia drifts, the war continues in a stalemate, and the country gradually weakens. History gives us a roadmap for understanding what happens when authoritarian leaders begin to lose control. And the patterns are remarkably consistent. Consider Nicolae Ceausescu of Romania. For decades, he ruled with an iron fist, building a cult of personality and crushing any hint of dissent. But in 1989, when protests erupted, his military refused to fire on civilians. Within days, he went from absolute ruler to executed prisoner. The transition was swift and brutal. Or look at the Soviet Union itself. Mikhail Gorbachev introduced reforms, thinking he could control the process of change. But once the lid came off, once people felt safe to express their discontent, the whole system collapsed faster than anyone predicted. The Soviet Union, which had seemed permanent and powerful, dissolved in a matter of months. The lesson from these historical examples is that authoritarian systems can appear stable right up until the moment they collapse. And the collapse, when it comes, is often triggered by the military withdrawing its support. Russia has its own particular history with military coups and palace intrigue. The murder of Rasputin involved members of the imperial family and military officers. The Bolshevik Revolution succeeded partly because soldiers sided with the revolutionaries. Even in Soviet times, there were attempted coups and leadership transitions that involved military maneuvering. Putin himself came to power in part through the careful management of Russia's security services and military. He understood that loyalty from these institutions was essential to maintaining power. But loyalty is a two-way street. If the military feels that Putin has become a liability, if they believe he's leading Russia toward disaster, they have both the capability and potentially the will to remove him. One of the most important questions is timing. When does discontent turn into action? When do private conversations about succession become actual plans for regime change? History suggests that the trigger is often a crisis or a moment of perceived weakness. In Ceausescu's case, it was the protests. In the Soviet Union, it was economic collapse and the loss of Eastern Europe. For Putin, the trigger could be a major military defeat in Ukraine, a severe economic crisis at home, or simply the perception that he's losing control. These leaks may themselves be part of that process. By revealing the extent of military discontent, they weaken Putin's position further. They embolden his critics and give potential conspirators the sense that they're not alone, that others share their concerns. For years, there's been a debate about whether democracy or authoritarianism represents the future of global governance. Leaders like Putin and Xi Jinping have argued that their systems are more efficient, more stable, more capable of getting things done without the messy complications of democratic debate. But this leak exposes a fundamental weakness of authoritarian systems. When power is concentrated in one person, when there are no checks and balances, when criticism is suppressed, bad decisions get made and then compound because no one can stop them. Putin decided to invade Ukraine despite warnings from his own intelligence services that it would be harder than expected. He ignored military advice about the challenges of the operation. He dismissed economic concerns about sanctions. And now, Russia is paying the price for those decisions. But the system provided no way to prevent them or correct them. This matters globally because it demonstrates to other nations that the authoritarian model isn't as strong as it appears. Yes, dictators can act quickly and decisively, but they can also make catastrophic mistakes. And when they do, there's no mechanism to stop the damage. For Ukraine, these leaks are validation. They've been telling the world that they can win this war if given the tools and support. They've been arguing that Russian power is overrated, that the invasion was a strategic blunder, that persistence will be rewarded. This leak confirms all of that. For the broader world, the message is clear. Resistance to aggression works. When a dictator invades a neighbor, the international community has choices. It can appease and hope for the best, or it can stand firm and support the victim. The Ukraine war is proving that the latter approach, while costly and difficult, can succeed. This has implications far beyond Ukraine. It affects how other potential aggressors, whether in Asia or elsewhere, calculate the costs and benefits of military action. If Russia, with all its resources and nuclear weapons, can't successfully conquer its smaller neighbor, what does that say about the feasibility of other territorial ambitions? We have to address the elephant in the room: Russia's nuclear arsenal. Throughout this conflict, there's been fear that Putin, if cornered, might resort to nuclear weapons. These leaks actually provide some reassurance on this point. If Russia's military leadership is already questioning Putin's judgment, if they're already thinking about a post-Putin future, they're unlikely to follow orders that would guarantee Russia's total destruction. The use of nuclear weapons would trigger massive retaliation from NATO and would make Russia a permanent pariah state. No rational military commander wants that outcome. This doesn't mean the nuclear risk is zero, but it does suggest that the command chain between Putin and the actual launch of weapons includes people who are thinking about their own survival and Russia's future, not just blind obedience to orders. So where does this leave us? In the short term, expect Putin to respond to these leaks with a crackdown. There will likely be investigations, arrests, and probably more purges. He'll try to reassert control and demonstrate that he's still firmly in charge. But the genie is out of the bottle now. The Russian military and elite know that discontent is widespread, that they're not alone in questioning Putin's leadership. That knowledge is powerful and dangerous to any dictator. For Ukraine and its Western allies, this is a moment to press their advantage. Not militarily in a reckless way, but strategically. This is the time to increase support to Ukraine, to tighten sanctions on Russia, to isolate Putin further. The goal should be to make it clear that there's no path to victory for Russia as long as Putin remains in power, but that there could be a different future under different leadership. But beyond the immediate tactical considerations, these leaks remind us of a larger truth about power and leadership. No leader, no matter how powerful they seem, can rule alone. They need the support of institutions, of military commanders, of the people who actually implement their decisions. When that support erodes, when the people around the leader start to see them as a liability rather than an asset, power becomes fragile. This is true in authoritarian systems and democratic ones, though democracies have better mechanisms for peaceful transitions. Putin built his power on an image of strength, on the idea that he was the one person who could restore Russia to greatness. But strength that's based on fear and repression is inherently unstable. Real strength comes from legitimacy, from actually serving the interests of your people and country. By launching this disastrous war, by refusing to admit mistakes, by doubling down on failed strategies, Putin has revealed his weakness. And now, his own generals see it too. This story is far from over. We're watching history unfold in real time, and the implications will be felt for years, possibly decades to come. What happens in Russia over the next months could reshape global politics, could redefine the balance of power, could determine whether authoritarian aggression remains a viable strategy in the 21st century. For the people of Ukraine, who have suffered so much, these leaks offer hope. Not because their struggle is over, but because they show that their resistance is working, that their courage is having an impact, that the aggressor who invaded their country is crumbling from within. For those of us watching from outside, these leaks are a reminder that we have a stake in this conflict. The question of whether aggression will be rewarded or punished, whether dictators can act with impunity or face consequences, whether the international order will be based on rules or simply on power, these questions affect all of us. The betrayal of Putin by his generals isn't just a Russian story. It's a story about the limits of authoritarian power, about the importance of accountability, about the ultimate futility of trying to build an empire on lies and fear. Throughout history, we've seen this pattern repeat. Leaders who centralize power, who eliminate dissent, who surround themselves with yes men, they may appear strong for a time. But that strength is an illusion. Real strength comes from institutions, from genuine support, from systems that can correct mistakes and adapt to changing circumstances. Putin built a system where only his voice mattered, where disagreement was dangerous, where loyalty was more important than competence. And now that system is failing him when he needs it most. The very structure he created to consolidate his power has become his weakness. And as this story continues to develop, as more information comes to light, as the situation in Russia evolves, we'll be here to analyze it, to provide context, to help make sense of what it all means. If you found this analysis valuable, if it helped you understand the significance of these leaks and what they mean for the future, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. This kind of in-depth analysis takes time and research, and your support makes it possible for us to continue providing it. Share this with others who might be interested. The more people who understand what's really happening in Russia, the better informed our public discourse will be. And in times like these, when so much is at stake, informed public discourse matters more than ever. Leave your thoughts in the comments. What do you think will happen next? Do you think Putin can survive this? What should the West's response be? These are important questions, and the conversation is valuable. Thank you for watching. Thank you for engaging with this content, and thank you for caring about these issues. We'll continue to follow this story and bring you updates as the situation develops. Until next time, stay informed, stay engaged, and remember that in the long run, truth and justice have a way of prevailing over lies and tyranny. Good night, and good luck.